And here we are again. Welcome back, everybody, to Sociology 241 COVID edition. And the awful sound of me slurping hot coffee into a microphone. Okay, so what we're talking about today is a variety of different things around the theme that COVID-19 is not a natural disaster. In other words, you could be forgiven for reading the news and thinking about this pandemic and saying to yourself, well, we didn't know this was coming, and there's nothing that we could have done about it. It wasn't our fault as humanity, as society. This was an organism, a virus that jumped from an animal into a human, and then took off around the world, and that phenomenon of a zoonotic infectious disease is independent of human society, unrelated to human society. You could be forgiven for coming away with that impression, in the very same way that you could be forgiven for taking a look at what happened in New Orleans in 2005, or in the Gulf of Mexico in 2010, and saying, you know, well, or maybe not with the BP oil spill, because that was kind of more clearly anthropogenic, but if you look at New Orleans and Hurricane Katrina, or you know, the tornadoes right here in central Illinois, you could be forgiven for coming away from that thinking to yourself, well, you know, that was a natural disaster, right? The weather patterns that created that, the moisture, the wind, that is out of our hands as human beings. And so the point of this presentation is, from a sociological perspective, to make the argument that that's simplistic, if not altogether erroneous. So we're going to use scare quotes around the word natural from this point forward when we talk about natural disasters, because there are, in fact, no natural disasters. That is not a thing from the sociological perspective. Why? Well, because when disasters strike, Busta Rhymes album, 1990s rap music, look it up if you don't believe me. I don't know why you wouldn't believe me, but that's where my head is at. 90s rap. What was I saying? Yes, when disaster strikes. When disaster strikes, it strikes, well, you know, one of the readings that we did for today put it this way. If it doesn't affect humans, it isn't a disaster, right? And so the very concept of disaster only comes into play when a natural phenomenon interacts with human society, right? So if a volcano erupts and there's nobody there to get, you know, buried in molten lava, then it is not a disaster. If a volcano erupts and there's a village at the you know, base of the volcano, then it is a disaster. Then we define it as a disaster. And so only insofar as society has set itself up to be vulnerable to disasters can we properly call them disasters, and therefore we cannot call them natural, because they only happen, they only become disasters insofar as they interact with human society, and insofar as we set ourselves up to be vulnerable to them. Ding, da, da, da. Okay, so first of all, I want to dispel a little misapprehension that many of us currently possess, which is the idea that nobody knew that COVID-19 was going to happen, or that nobody knew that we would be smacked, gobsmacked. Actually, gobsmacked and smacked are not the same, but you know what I'm saying. Nobody knew that we would be whooped upside the head with a global pandemic. People knew, to be clear. A lot of people knew. Epidemiologists knew. Infectious disease scientists knew. Virologists knew. Nobody knew when. Nobody knew exactly what. But since the 1980s, scientists have been warning that human society is becoming more and more vulnerable to global infectious disease spread. And we've had, in just the last 2 decades, since the turn of the millennium, we've had SARS and MERS and Ebola and swine flu and avian flu. And so we've had a pretty dramatic ratcheting up of the number of global, well, not global pandemics, but the number of epidemics, the number of infectious diseases that have emerged and that have set off around large swaths of the planet, if not the whole damn thing, over the last 20 years. And this is the case for a number of reasons. But in one thing that I read that 90% of epidemiologists in a particular association of epidemiologists said that there was a possibility of a cataclysmic pandemic. They didn't know when. So, what I read said this could have happened. Epidemiologists were saying in this generation, and this was I think that it was 2015, this thing that I was reading, but it said either in this generation or the next. Right, so we're talking about, the span of several decades, but 90% of epidemiologists in a particular association back in 2015 had said in this generation or the next, good possibility of a cataclysmic pandemic. Now, a cataclysmic pandemic is different from a pandemic, is different from an epidemic. Cataclysm is, a pandemic on a much more significant scale. And I think that the 1918 influenza epidemic would qualify as cataclysmic. I mean, I may be paraphrasing badly, but I want to say something like a third of the world's population died. I mean, I know it was a lot of people regardless. That seems like more than right, but I feel like that's what I read. But anyway, it was a lot of damn people in 1918 that died. And a lot of people have died today. I mean, we crossed the 100,000 deaths threshold in the United States maybe a week ago, and we're just one country. So, and we got a long way to go. We've got, a year or something before we have a vaccine for this thing. So, so lots of people have died and lots more people will die. And I think this qualifies as cataclysmic. So what are the criteria to to determine whether a pandemic is cataclysmic or not? Well, the first is it global? Does it make it to every corner of the planet? And coronavirus, COVID-19, has done so. The second is, how easy or hard is it to treat? Well, there are no known treatments for COVID-19. The antivirals that exist have shown in some limited ability not to treat it, but to sort of diminish the duration. But there's no treatment for COVID-19, so I think that qualifies as hard to treat. And how deadly is it? COVID-19 isn't the deadliest infectious disease out there. Certainly Ebola, it is much more deadly, but COVID-19 is pretty damn serious. I think if we look broadly at the whole world, we're looking at a death rate on the order of, I want to say, maybe 5 to 7%. That's a lot of people. That's deadly. And what's interesting too, and I learned this when I was reading up on this in anticipation for this presentation, is that epidemics or infectious diseases rather that are really deadly, like Ebola, actually aren't as much of a threat, paradoxically, because this sounds perverse to say, but it makes sense if you think about it, because people die so often, the death rate is so high that it becomes much harder to transmit over long distances and over time. So very deadly infectious diseases are actually less of a risk for producing a cataclysmic global pandemic than infectious diseases like COVID-19, where lots of people die, but most people don't. And that's because if you don't die, and COVID-19 is particularly virulent, no pun intended, just kidding, totally intended, I'm that clever. COVID-19 is particularly virulent because there are so many of us who are asymptomatic carriers. And so we don't know that we have it, and we just go on about our lives and make everybody around us sick. So this same group of epidemiologists who said with almost certainty, almost unanimously said, certainly in the next couple of generations, cataclysmic pandemic. They said that this is probably going to be something zoonotic, which means something that jumps from a non-human animal to a human. And it's probably something that's going to come from East Asia or Southeast Asia. All of which has been, obviously made manifest, made concrete by COVID-19. And then finally they said, and this again was a thing that I was reading from 2015, that they strongly recommended an increase in the production of N95 face masks, which are the face masks that have the little kind of Star Wars looking piece that sticks out that filters viral particles, and that families, that households have a number of N95 masks on hand just in case. So that was a recommendation from several years ago, but long before anyone had ever imagined that COVID-19 would be a thing. And so if we as a people, as a society, were inclined to consume and put faith in and act on the recommendations of our leading scientists, not consume our leading scientists, but consume their work. If we were in the habit, if we had a culture of reading science, taking it up and acting on it, have COVID-19 would have come into a world in which every household in America would have had a stock of N95 masks on hand, where we would have had a medical system, a healthcare system that anticipated this and was prepared to ramp up capacity to accommodate it. But of course we didn't. So what are some of the ideal qualities for a pandemic germ? And I know we're getting a little bit tangential to the sociology of all of this, but it's interesting, and it isn't really, because it goes to the sort of like lack of preparedness, and it goes to the social, the way in which the social organization of our daily lives is actually at fault. So it isn't coronavirus, COVID-19, the virus itself isn't the thing that is killing us. I think that's kind of the point. It isn't the thing that's killing us, right? It's society that is killing us. Society that is allowing us to be vulnerable to COVID-19, right? So what are some of the ideal qualities for the kind of infectious disease that could become a cataclysmic pandemic? Well, can it be transmitted from human to human? Can it mutate rapidly? Is there no known treatment or vaccine? Can it be spread very quickly? Deadly, but as I said with Ebola, not too deadly for the reasons I specified. And then does it have an incubation period that allows people to spread it before they get symptomatic? What about if it's a virus, resistance to antivirals? And then, of course, there are different ways that we can transmit diseases. We can transmit diseases through what sort of grossly infectious disease people call the fecal-oral route, which means don't eat poop. Don't do it. I know you're all sitting there thinking about it. Don't eat poop. No fecal-oral route. But yeah, so, you know, a lot of things get us sick because microbes are in feces, and little microscopic bits of that feces gets in our water, gets onto our food, we consume that, we become sick. That's one way we can get an infectious disease. Another way we can get an infectious disease is through blood, right? And so a mosquito sucks somebody's blood, flies away, bites another person, and, you know, an infectious disease can be transmitted that way. So the fecal-oral route, the bloodstream, these are different ways, but the respiratory droplets are the most easily transmittable. And particularly if the droplet is a fine droplet that is sort of aerosolized, that isn't very heavy, and can sort of float and go further. So I've read that COVID-19 floats and rides wind currents like smoke. And so you can think of COVID-19, the way it moves, as it moves more like smoke than it does like water vapor, right? So if water vapor, you spray a spray bottle, and it's going to go, you know, maybe a couple of feet, and then it's going to sink. But smoke is going to float on wind currents much farther. I also read somewhere else that if you are close enough to a person to smell their cologne or perfume, then you're close enough to that person to get sick from them with COVID-19. So that allows that droplet-borne, that facility to be aerosolized, the lightness of the droplet, I guess, makes COVID-19 something that can be spread much more easily than infectious diseases that are spread through blood or through, you know, duty. Let's just call it what it is. Duty. So anyway, long story short, we kind of knew this was coming, or at least a lot of really smart people that do this, that study this stuff for a living, they didn't know that it was coming, but they were like, hey, this is probably coming. We really ought to prepare for it. And when you lay out all of the different criteria that make an infectious disease, that lend it to becoming a cataclysmic global pandemic, man, COVID-19 checks the boxes. So, there are no natural disasters, we are told. It doesn't make sense, right? It doesn't, I mean, it does make sense, but it's not intuitive. It's not immediately intuitive to say that there are no natural disasters, right? Tornadoes are natural, volcanoes are natural, hurricanes are natural, droughts are natural, right? There have been droughts on the planet long before there were human beings. True, absolutely true. But the thing is that it wouldn't, a natural phenomenon would not become a disaster except insofar as human society makes choices, makes affirmative choices about how to organize itself. And within those choices, we produce vulnerability. We make ourselves vulnerable. We have the choice. It is within our power as human beings to choose to make ourselves resilient, and instead we choose to make ourselves vulnerable. And so these two concepts that I want you to, if you're sitting around making notes on a piece of paper like we used to back in the old days, write these down: choice and vulnerability. Those are the two fundamental ideas, or the two fundamental sort of like concepts that help organize our thinking about the constructedness of so-called natural disasters. So on this slide here, there's a bunch of examples of things that human society chooses that influence the ways in which we interact with the biophysical world. We choose to set up, for example, systems, public systems, or to not set them up, to monitor weather, to assess risk, and to prepare for these eventualities. We choose to set up systems of healthcare to be sustainable, to be resilient, to be inclusive, to be accessible, or we choose to do the opposite. We choose as society whether we invest public money in public health. We choose as society whether we invest in public research, right? I mean, when we talked about public goods and when I asked you to write down what you thought some of the public goods, most important public goods to fight COVID-19 are, 90% of you said science, research, public research, which was an awesome answer. It was right on. We choose whether we invest public money in research for the benefit of the society or not. We also choose whether, at the end of the day, we accept science, whether we appreciate, whether we valorize, whether we take science seriously as a society and as a cultural value. We choose whether we invest in essential workers, whether we valorize essential workers, whether we pay them a dignified wage or not. We choose whether we cooperate with international bodies that are set up to monitor, to respond, so on and so forth. So all of the things that have, in the case of COVID-19, that have set us up to be vulnerable, those were things that on some level we chose to do. Right now, you might be saying to yourself, well, I didn't choose and nobody asked me. And of course, that's true. But as a society, these are things that we have socially produced. These are not things that are inevitable. We weren't born naked, buck naked, in a state of nature in a rainforest somewhere, being like, you know what? Let's invent fire and then the wheel and then language and then, healthcare that preys on people's inequalities and sets us up to be vulnerable, right? I mean, it happened somehow. So vulnerability. So, we know that choice produces vulnerability, and of course the counterpoint to that is also true. We can choose to make ourselves resilient. We can choose to make ourselves able to withstand, able to stand up to things, or we can choose to make ourselves vulnerable. And so when we look at society, we see as one of the sort of fundamental social structures, one of the fundamental themes that is consistent across space and time, we see inequality, right? And what I mean by that is, if you go back in time in the United States, there's going to be inequality. Some person is going to have more than another person. If you go across space, from the East Coast to the West Coast and everything in between, you're going to find inequality, right? So across space and time, one thing is certain, and that is there will be inequality. So this makes us differently as individuals and as social groups within a broader society, differently vulnerable. And I think this should come as no surprise to you. We've actually talked and read and thought at length about racial inequality and spatial inequality and the legacy of racism in the United States, and how that has made Black and Latino people and families and communities disproportionately vulnerable to COVID-19. So here is a list of just some of the different ways in which vulnerability shapes the way that a society absorbs an attack by the biophysical world. So sanitation infrastructure, right? If we're set up to have access to clean water, if we're set up to have access to sewers, we can wash our hands, we can take showers, we can not have poop just kind of laying around. You know what I mean? If we don't have any sewers and we don't have any plumbing, and then it's just going to be like poop kind of just hanging out in different places, it's going to be way easier to accidentally get it into your mouth, right? If we've got toilets and we've got water and we've got soap and all these things, we've got sewers and we've got waste treatment plants, it's much, much harder for us to actually put the poop in our mouths. So sanitation infrastructure really matters. Well, guess what? Lots of places don't have sanitation infrastructure like we do. And in fact, in the United States, there are places that have different levels of sanitation infrastructure, right? I mean, the most famous and obvious case would be the public water in Flint, Michigan. But there are places all around the country where water is not potable, where I mean, I had a sewer backup in my basement last year or 2 years ago, right? So I had like a couple of inches, a couple solid inches of other people's shit all over the floor of my basement, right? That's a sanitation infrastructure failure. But here we have good sanitation infrastructure, right? I mean, in many places in the developing world, in sub-Saharan Africa, when I lived in Guatemala for a number of years, I didn't have running water in my house. I had a latrine, a pit latrine in the backyard. Basically, there's a hole in the ground with a place to sit. So, but uh, other places don't even have that, don't even have a hole in the ground. So then you're just uh, dropping a deuce in a field or something. Oh my goodness, this is the most scatological lecture I've ever given in my life. Poop, poop de poop, poop de scoop. I'm Kanye West. Um, Safe air and water. Uh, if we have access to that, if we lack access to that, that's going to make a big difference in terms of our vulnerability. Our individual household socioeconomic status, our income is going to matter for our access to healthcare. It's going to matter for our access to political capital. It's going to matter for our education level. It's going to make a difference in a whole bunch of different ways in how we are able to metabolize hazards and risks. Social capital, I actually don't have that on this list, but I should. So add that if you're making notes, add that to your list. Social infrastructure / social capital, right? If you get hit with a tornado, if you get hit with a hurricane and you're on the roof of your house and the water is 17 feet high, and people around you, you're a lot more likely to get out safely, right? If you are an isolated person, if you don't have any relationships with the people around you, it's going to be a lot harder. We saw that in Kleinenberg's example of the heat wave in Chicago as well. Um, Race matters, right? Space matters. What kind of a building do you live in? If you live in a slum and there's a fire, you're a lot more likely to um, perish or be unsafe than if you live in an upper middle class suburb and have a sprinkler system and have a really well funded paid firefighter, what do you call that system? I don't know, can't think of the word. So all of these things create vulnerability, and then vulnerability creates disaster. Only insofar as we allow ourselves to be vulnerable can we create disasters. So where does vulnerability come from, right? Well, I would argue that vulnerability is a function, or has at least, if it wasn't created by, it has at least been radically exacerbated by neoliberal globalization, by globalized capitalism, as the slide says. So there's a whole bunch of different ways that global capitalism has made us more vulnerable, has set us up to be not very resilient in the face of a global infectious disease pandemic, and also has set us up to be more likely to get sick. Right. So again, it is no coincidence, as Karen Kendrick mentions in her piece that we read for today, it's no coincidence that the rise of infectious diseases coincides with the emergence of neoliberalism, right? It's no coincidence that in the last 20 years, from the turn of the millennium forward, we've had all of these infectious diseases that have spread around the world: Ebola, avian, swine flu. And it's no coincidence either that like half the infectious diseases they have like animal names: swine flu, monkey pox, rabbit ears. That one's not real. Avian flu, bird flu, right? These are, Why do half of the infectious diseases that we've heard about have animal names? Well, because of globalized capitalism, right? Because have you seen the Amazon lately? That used to be a rainforest. Did you know that? Did you think the Amazon was always just a monoculture of soybeans and African palm? That used to be a rainforest. And so when we open up new frontiers on the planet, when human society moves farther and farther into corners of the planet that haven't been inhabited and settled and chopped down and burned and farmed and cultivated, what we're doing is we're opening a little Pandora's box each time. We are allowing zoonotic pathogens to escape their ecosystems and get out into the wider world where we've set ourselves up to be really vulnerable to them, right? So every time we open up a new frontier, and that's why, going back to the one of the earlier slides, that's why epidemiologists were like, this shit is going to come from East Asia or Southeast Asia almost certainly, because in China and in Southeast Asia, these are the places in the world where we are opening up new frontiers to human settlement and cultivation more rapidly at a greater rate than anywhere else. And so every time we do that, we create an opportunity for these zoonotic pathogens to jump into people. Every time every time we eat bush meat, I wonder if that's like a problematic phrase. I don't know. Anyway, every time we eat non-cultivated meat, right? Every time we hunt for food, every time we go to an open air wet market in the developing world and people are selling flesh that they just kind of come across that isn't cultivated under some sort of particular conditions, that isn't monitored, right? Every time that happens, we're opening ourselves up to the possibility that that animal is going to have some zoonotic disease and that our consumption of it is going to transfer that pathogen into us, right? So as we globalize, as we intensify the global network, as we become basically one community of place, we come together more and more, and we move around the world more and more. So, all of the people in the world, we're all moving around the world all the time, and not just people, but trade too. We're moving things around the world all the time, right? I mean, global assembly of consumer durable commodities is bugged out, right? I mean, this is not new information, but it's still completely bugged out, the way in which we mine minerals all over the world. We create the sort of early inputs to things in different places, the assembly in different places, the design in different places. And I mean, you buy your shirt and it says made in China, but we don't know where the cotton was made. We don't know where it was sewn. We don't know if maybe it was assembled in China, or maybe they just sewed the tag on in China. So we live in a really truly global economy, which is really complex, and that makes it way easier for us to spread pathogens around the world. And then of course we live in a world that we are eating up very, very quickly, which makes it much more likely that we're going to contract pathogens. So we've set ourselves up as a world to be in a position to get sick and then get everybody else sick very easily. I said, leisure and business travel, trade. I said CAFOs here, which is a confined animal feeding operation, or a concentrated animal feeding operation. I don't know what the C stands for. It's both of those, but anyway, that is certainly a way in which zoonotic diseases can be distributed very easily. Another part of this isn't just the global network of people and things, but density. And I don't mean, and I'm not going back to the demonizing density conversation that we had some days ago. I'm not saying like all cities all the time, but in particular, I'm thinking about like slums and shanty towns and favelas and asentamientos and these things across the developing world that on the outskirts of cities that are informal or semi-formal kinds of real estate development that where everybody's packed in together, where there's very little sanitation infrastructure. Those kinds of situations are the product of global capitalism. They're the product of inequality. They're the outcome of the radical exacerbation of the gap between the so-called haves and have-nots. And so that also makes us vulnerable. That intense inequality in terms of the way different groups of people live in different places makes us much more vulnerable. So for all of these reasons, I think if we were to draw a sort of like causal diagram, we would say globalized capitalism produces the particular kinds of societal vulnerability that then produce natural disasters, right? Or so-called natural disasters. So, in the U.S. in particular, we're bad at taking care of our people, right? And I won't belabor this because we did a whole lecture on this very recently, but we're bad at taking care of our people. And as a case in point, we are, in terms of GDP, we are the richest country in the world. We are the richest country in the world. And yet we are number 38 out of something like 145 countries. Number 38 in terms of life expectancy. We have lower life expectancy than Lebanon, which is right above us. It's number 37. And we have a marginally, fractionally better life expectancy than Cuba, our diplomatic best friend, which is number 39. So you would expect, it would stand to reason, that the richest country in the world would have among the best life expectancy, and we don't. And it's because of our inequality. It's because of our privatized and corporatized and generally very expensive healthcare. So I particularly like this quotation from the reading that we did. The concept of rapid onset disasters is imaginary. So if we were together, I would say to you, let's reflect a little bit on what exactly that means. When a hurricane bears down on your city, when a tornado plants itself on your house, when a levee fails, when a dam fails, and your block floods, these things happen very quickly, right? And because the speed of the damage, the speed of the sort of acquisition of harm is very fast, it leaves us with the impression that disasters come on very suddenly. I can't quite get my hat right. I'm fiddling with it too much. Disasters come on very suddenly, and it leaves us with the erroneous impression that there was very little that we could do about it, that we didn't know it was coming, that it happened so quickly, right? And so the Ian Kellman, I believe is his name, the author of the little piece that we read for today, says, and I just like this turn of phrase, the concept of rapid onset disasters is imaginary. Every disaster is a slow motion disaster. There is no such thing as a real-time disaster. There are only slow motion disasters. But how can that be? Well, so his point is that the process of setting society up is a very long-term, ongoing process, right? I mean, think, for example, we started the previous slide, we were talking about globalized capitalism and how globalized capitalism created the conditions for our vulnerability to these kinds of pandemics. Okay. Well, where did globalized capitalism come from, and how long did it take to come to happen, right? I mean, a lot of us would sort of date global or neoliberal capitalism to the 1970s, late 70s. But some of us, you know, the sort of historical macro sociologists would say, you know, it really dates all the way back to the, you know, to the 1500s, right? And so this is a long-term historical process that has taken place incrementally. I mean, how long does it take to build a house? 3-4 months, maybe? How long does it take to produce the design for the house? How long does it take to cut the lumber for the house and make the drywall? How long does it take for a society to arrive at a design of what a subdivision is going to look like? How long does it take for a society to come up with sewers and put them in place? How long does it take for societies to design the idea of dams and put them into place? And how long does it take for us to create the universities and the programs that train the engineers that design these things? I mean, this does not happen overnight. In fact, I don't think we could ever say, well, it takes X amount of time. Rather, we should say that it's always ongoing, right? As my old former professor, institutional economics professor at the University of Wisconsin used to say, the economy is always in the process of becoming. And so the same thing could be said for our vulnerability to disasters, or the disasters themselves, right? The disaster is always in the process of becoming. The disaster is never fully realized. The disaster doesn't have a fixed point of origin and a fixed point of termination. It is an ongoing, constant social process or set of processes, right? So from the reading, you know, here are all these examples of different small ways that we that the disasters themselves that we perceive as happening in real time and happening very quickly are actually things that happen over the long term, and as a function of our vulnerability, right? Well, a flood is only a flood if it messes with you, right? If nobody's there to see it, it's not a flood. At least it's not a disastrous flood. But what if you have the wealth and the resources and the savvy to not live in a floodplain? What if you don't? What if you lack the resources? And what if you lack the savvy to not live in a floodplain? What if you have the wealth to live in a place where there's lots of groundwater of a high quality? What if you don't? What if you lack the wealth and lack the power to live in that place? Why? Why can't you move? Well, maybe all the good land has been consolidated into the hands of a few large landholders. And maybe the only land left for a family like yours is that arid, dry land that is drought prone. How long does it take for us to set up our cities to be resilient to natural disasters? How long does it take for us to create a society in which members of minoritized racial groups lack the power to advocate for themselves, to be heard, and for their requests to be acted on? Climate change, right? Climate change, we've known about climate change for, since at least the 1950s. This is an ongoing thing that's been happening for a long time. Climate change makes, it heats up the whole planet, and that makes the planet more hospitable to more bacterial growth for bacterial infections, more mosquitoes and ticks and things to transport infectious diseases, right? So there is no such thing, in other words, as we didn't know what was going to happen. There was nothing that we could have done. It just overwhelmed us very suddenly. No, it's a very incremental, long-term, historical, and always ongoing societal set of processes of creating vulnerability and resilience. And I think, to me, as an environmental sociologist, one of the parts of this, one of the lessons from this, or one of the things that I take away from it that is the most salient and the most provocative, is that this particular crisis, this pandemic, has unveiled for many people that aren't environmental sociologists and don't spend their whole days thinking about these things. It has unveiled the false dichotomy between nature and society, right? And so we often make this distinction. It's a heuristic distinction that we make in our daily lives because it helps us make sense of things. We think, okay, well, nature is over here, the wilderness is over here. I go to a national park and I'm in nature and there's moose, and then society is over here. There's buildings, sidewalks, roads, all that stuff. And these are two separate things. You cannot have nature inside society. You cannot have society inside of nature. They are mutually exclusive. Not only are they not mutually exclusive, they're not even different things, right? In my environmental sociology class, I talk about this, and I give the example of a building, a skyscraper versus a beaver dam, right? Now we think of a skyscraper as being unnatural, as being artificial, as being anti-nature. But if you were like hiking in the woods and you came across a beaver dam, you'd be like, what a magical phenomenon of nature, right? But when we distill these things down to their fundamental processes, what's happening in the construction of a ¿cómo se llama? Rascacielos, skyscraper. What's happening at the fundamental core of the construction of a skyscraper versus the construction of a beaver dam? You've got animals, right? Human beings are animals, beavers are animals. Marshaling resources, chopping down trees, cutting up branches, or firing up brickworks and making mortar, right? These are the same thing. Animals marshaling natural resources to create a structure. Well, a beaver dam changes the course of a river. It is a dam, right? It stops the river from flowing. And in so doing, it has a negative effect on the riverine ecosystems, right? And the animals and the biota in the river are negatively affected by the beaver dam. Well, building a skyscraper, that's going to have a negative effect on air quality and water quality and a whole bunch of other environmental phenomena. But maybe the scale is different, but the processes are the same. You cannot be outside of nature. We are natural beings. This computer and this desk and these books behind me, this is inside of nature. You see what I'm saying? And so this photograph, I love this photograph that you're looking at here. This is the border, this road that you are seeing here that I'm going to light up with some purple. This road here traces the border between the Dominican Republic and Haiti. Okay, and so, Dominican Republic, DR, and Haiti are two sides of the same island, Hispaniola. And the Dominican Republic is getting towards a middle income country. Haiti is pretty sure it's the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. Haiti is a very poor country. Now, we have in some ways what sociologists might call a natural experiment, because these are two halves of the same island. It's the same space. It's the same place. The soil is the same. The weather is the same. The temperature, the climate, the biosphere, it's all the same. So all of those, in a natural experiment, those variables are just kind of controlled for, right? They're the same. So what's different between Haiti and the Dominican Republic? The history is different. The politics are different. The economics are different. And those things have produced radically different outcomes. The racial makeup is different. The history of colonization is different, right? But look at that, the starkness of the two sides of that border. On our left, we see Haiti, which has no forest cover left at all. And on our right, we see the Dominican Republic, which is much greener, much more lush, still has a good deal of forest cover, right? So you see here that human society, and particularly economic conditions, condition the natural world, shapes the natural world. Nature isn't a function, nature in scare quotes, isn't a function of biophysical processes that happen independent of human society. Nature is created by human society, right? We create our biophysical worlds. I mean, this is a stark example of how poverty and political and economic dysfunction cut down trees, right? People don't cut down trees. Chainsaws don't cut down trees. Poverty and political economic dysfunction cut down trees. And that's why the incredibly stark difference in this photograph between the Haiti side and the Dominican Republic side. Another quote that I really liked from the reading, from a different reading, the New Yorker one by Kim Stanley Robinson, is this quote that I used as the title for the slide, which is, "The whole system is a technical improvisation that science keeps from crashing down." And so what Kim Stanley Robinson is saying, I think, in this quote is, I mean, it's a comment on the complexity of modern global capitalist human society, which is a pretty complex set of relationships. So he's saying that science, by which I presume he means like sort of applied science, design and management, keeps this infinitely complex set of relationships working in concert. But it is so complex, and the structure that keeps it working in concert is so decentralized and so fragile that it's imaginable that it could all come crashing down. And, you know, I think, so Stanley Robinson is talking about climate change and COVID-19, and I think COVID-19 has been in some ways our first taste of what it might feel like if this thing came crashing down, right? I mean, so I ask rhetorically at the end of this slide, will we learn from this how to handle future crises? Well, what kinds of future crises are we going to see? Well, we're probably going to see more pandemics. We're probably going to see cyber attacks. Those cyber attacks are probably going to steal our personal information. They're going to take out the internet. They're going to take out electricity. They're going to take out, telephone access, right? All of these things that we've come to count on are vulnerable. It is a technical improvisation that is vulnerable to coming crashing down, right? We've talked about our centralized, globalized corporate food system and how COVID-19 has, has ruptured supply chains from everything from toilet paper to, pork chops. It is not hard for us to imagine a future in which you go to the store and your options are, well, there's canned green beans, we have a few ears of corn left, you know what I'm saying? And there's, a couple of eggs, right? I mean, you can imagine that. It wasn't that long ago when my grandparents probably would go to the store, and it wasn't a Kroger, it wasn't a big grocery store, it was a small neighborhood grocery store, and they'd go to the grocery store and they'd say, "What do you have today?" Right? And the owner would say, "Well, we just got in a shipment of eggs. We've got a little bit of, we've got some tomatoes and, all the dried goods," right? So it is not, we don't have, there's no guarantee, there's no legal promise that somebody signed somewhere that says you will always have access to every fucking thing in the grocery store. So we can imagine a world, we came from a world not too long ago where our access wasn't as unfettered as it is now. We can imagine going back to that world. We came from a place where we didn't have electric grids all over the world that you could turn on a light at any moment and be guaranteed to have an endless, affordable supply of electricity. Right? We can imagine a world where that dries up. We can imagine a world where we run out of fossil fuels. We can imagine a world where electricity from renewable sources is prohibitively expensive for many families. Right? So he says in the essay that we read, this was too deadly to be a dress rehearsal. But in some ways, what this has done is what COVID-19 has done is it has allowed us, it has unveiled the vulnerabilities of the system. It has illustrated for us the fact that has always been the case, but that we hadn't stopped to reflect on until now, that this whole system is a technical improvisation that science keeps from crashing down, right? And now we are just all too aware of it. And now we can envision, and so that's why Stanley Robinson is talking about this is rewriting our imaginations, right? That the way we think and that the structure of emotion, our epistemology, if you will, has finally caught up to the Anthropocene, the age of climate change, the sort of end times logic. It is just like it's not weird anymore to be, wearing a mask in the grocery store. It's not weird anymore to be like, this might be it. Grandchild, sorry. You won't know what this felt like, but we ruined it for you. It's not weird anymore to have dystopian fantasies. It doesn't make you like the weird person in your class, like combing your hair into your face or something. I think it's probably a pretty reasonable and pretty common response to COVID-19 and to this new way of thinking to have dystopian fantasies, to kind of join the end times cult. Doesn't feel like a cult anymore. Feels like meh. It's just kind of end times. So yeah, so I thought it was a provocative and interesting kind of look, and in a summative way that I wanted us to take up here towards the end of the class. And so I'll leave you with this slide. So Stanley Robinson says, writes, "We are all now stuck in a science fiction novel that we're writing together." Which I like. It's, again, a nice turn of phrase. And so he is very hopeful, right? I wish I could be so hopeful. But he closes with, I don't know if he closes with, I don't remember, but he poses a bunch of rhetorical questions in the essay. Is this going to move us toward collective action on things that we really friggin' need to act collectively on, like climate change, like not burning ourselves up to death. Um, will COVID-19, will the fact that we all have this practice now working together to flatten the curve, will that help us when it comes time to fight climate change? Will it help us move toward collective action? Or, and my cynical answer is, will we just become further polarized and politicized, like masking has become, which is just so weird, so crazy. You go to the grocery store and you know right away who's who, because some are wearing masks and some aren't. Will this renew our faith in science, right? Will we stop being probably the most anti-science society among wealthy countries across the world? Will this be something that will be stuck in our imaginations into the future? Or will it be relegated to history books? Is this something that in a few months, or several months, when we've got a vaccine and it's not a worry anymore, we just go back to the way everything was? We open up again, and we're open for business again, and air travel resumes like it always has, and all the conferences and all the music venues and all the restaurants and all the shopping just resumes like it always has, and we just go back to normal, or even worse, we rebound from it, and we bounce so far back that we ratchet up consumption and ratchet up fossil fuel burning, and right. I mean, this is a crossroads at which we could really go two directions. One would be toward a sustainable future, and one would be away from that, toward the end times cult. And it is not clear to me which direction as a society and as a world we're going to choose, which path we're going to take at this fork in the road. But the fact that we are at a fork in the road, and that fork and the choice that we're confronted with is the choice between life and death, that is very clear to me, and to you, I assume, as well. Okay, nice to see ya. Bye.